4.0, all right? Lecture and dialogue series. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude and congratulations to Global Peace Mission Malaysia, Yadim, Droplet of Mercy, Jakim, and everyone for initiating and organizing this auspicious event. Congratulations. For your information, Prof and everyone, previously we had a wonderful and fantastic Usrah Madani sessions, Usrah Madani 1.0 with Professor Mehmet Asotei from Durham University on institutional reform, Alhamdulillah. For Usrah Madani 2.0, we had Sheikh Professor Dr Said Fudah. We talk on Islamic theology. And Usrah Madani 3.0, we brought Professor Dr Muhammad Din Shamsuddin on political Islam, three different topics. And this time, we specifically chose the Usrah Madani 4.0 themes, multi-faith community interactions on Islamophobia. So let us listen from the professor to talk about Islamophobia. This is the books, one of the books by Professor Khaled, The New Crusades, Islamophobia and the Global War on Muslims. Very sensational, alhamdulillah. My deepest and heartfelt gratitude to Professor Khaled and everyone. We are fortunate to have Professor here, indeed a reputable and renowned scholar. May Allah bless you, Prof. Yeah? From my point of view, when you talk about the intellectuals, we need more intellectual discourse. We need more intellectuals. The Ummah needs more true and quality and capable intellectuals to lead and guide us in facing new realities and addressing issues and problems in this challenging world. I quoted the words of Edward Said in Representations of the Intellectuals. There has been no major revolutions in modern history without intellectuals. Conversely, there has been no major counter-revolutionary movement without intellectuals. Intellectuals have been the fathers and mothers of the movement, and of course, sons and daughters, even nephews and nieces. So we need more public intellectuals. Ladies and gentlemen, talking about Islamophobia, okay, this is one of my area of research long time ago on Islamophobia, either private, structural, or dialectical Islamophobia. Islamophobia is synonymously known as the other term used, like anti-Muslim hatred, fear and suspicion of Islam, anti-Muslims, perceived Muslimness, and anti-Muslim racism. In short, it refers to a fear, prejudice, and hatred of Muslims that leads to provocations, hostility, and violence. But now it goes beyond that. Islamophobia evolved, follow the passage of times. Last month, I went to London, had discussions with the community leaders in London. We also talk about Islamophobia. So I would like to highlight several points on Islamophobia, might trigger and spark the discussion after this with the speech by Professor Khaled. Islamophobia has evolved beyond mere racial hatred to encompass animosity toward Islam, not only hatred to Muslims, but now hatred to Islam as religion and hatred to Islam as a civilization. It's point number one. And Islamophobia now is also a systematic, fluid, and deeply politicized. This is the point number one. New form Islamophobia. Point number two, Islamophobia as a modern colonial project is not coincidental. It's by design. Positing Muslims as violent, terrorist, barbaric, uncivilized, backward, despotic, oppressive, irrational, and etc., etc. And the point number three, Islamophobia now is linked to the key narratives, the important narrative. Islam is inherently and uniquely supportive of violence, and Muslims are predisposed to terrorism or sympathetic to it. So this is a key narrative. And finally, the fourth point, the rise of Muslims extremisms. In the context of Malaysia, we can witness the rise in extremism, where religion and race are used to gain support. Despite Malaysia's reputation as a peace-loving nation, there is now a troubling rise in extremism and racial prejudice. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will not prolong my speech. I just want to highlight something to fathom or something to think, to ponder, that what can be done, and what next. So, we need more dialogues. We need more meaningful engagement, not only among the Muslims, but also with the non-Muslims. Because the root cause of the Islamophobia is not the clash of civilization, as said by Huntington, or clash of fundamentalism, as said by Tariq Ali, but it's a clash of ignorance, as said by Edward Said. Last 2 months, I had an excellent discussions with the International Islamic Institute of Thought, as well as with Sheikh Ali from the Association of Muslim Social Scientists, together with the Prime Minister. We explored the theme of Islamophobia and discussed the possibility of introducing a new discipline to address Islamophobia. Because so far, in the entire educational institutions, we don't have a disciplines that be able to address the issue of Islamophobia. So perhaps we need Islamophobia studies, coupled with the Madani studies, inshallah, to empower and to address the issue of Islamophobia. With that note, I wish all of you have a fruitful discussion. And thank you very much once again to Professor Khaled. Welcome to Malaysia. I hope you enjoy the Malaysians' hospitality and weather and the food as well. Wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, YB Senator Dr Zulkifli Hasan, for the insightful context on Islamophobia. To commence our series, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Khaled Beydoun, a prominent advocate for interfaith dialogue and a respected voice in the fight against Islamophobia. He is also an associate professor law at the Arizona State University. Professor Beydoun also research examines the First Amendment, race, national security, and their intersections. His academic work has been featured in top academic journals, including the UCLA Law Review, Northwestern Law Review, the California Law Review. And in recent years, he has emerged as a leading voice on Arab, Middle Eastern, and Muslim identity on the diversity, inclusion, and equity (DIEE) space, holding trainings at Fortune 100 companies, including Apple, Meta, Nike, Google, and many more. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Beydoun.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's great to be here. Jum'ah Mubarak. Thank you, Minister, for those generous words, and thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be here with Global Peace Mission of Malaysia. Abim, thank you for a great week. Me and my wife have enjoyed a really excellent couple of days here in Malaysia. Inshallah, it's the first of many visits, and inshallah, it's the first of many conversations that we can have as Muslims, a transnational Muslim community, on many issues that we currently face right now, one of which is Islamophobia. Islamophobia, I want you to think about Islamophobia as sort of the marrow, the center, the crux of many crises, many catastrophes that we Muslims are facing right now in real time in the world. I want to speak for roughly maybe, us professors, we can be long-winded. Inshallah, I won't be very long-winded, but roughly maybe 30 to 40 minutes, and I would really love it to be a more interactive conversation about the range, about the myriad of issues that I'll raise during my lecture with all of you. So, I'm a professor, so if you're taking notes and you're writing down questions, that's a good thing. because inshallah, the more conversation, the more questions that arise, the more beneficial and fruitful this exchange will be. I'm really happy and heartened, Minister, that you brought up the name of Edward Said. Edward Said is a hero. Edward Said is an intellectual North Star. Edward Said is, in many respects, the very reason I decided to become an academic, become a scholar, become an activist, and write books. And when you were speaking, Minister, and you actually cited my favorite book from Edward Said. Surprisingly enough, Edward Said is famous for a number of books, chief of which is Orientalism. By a show of hands, who has read Orientalism? Okay, so some people, for those of you who haven't read Orientalism, please read that book. That book is paramount. That book is essential for understanding Islamophobia in the world today. But the book you cited, Minister, was Representations of the Intellectual, which is a short book by Edward Said. And in that book, Edward Said features the works of prominent landmark intellectuals like Noam Chomsky, like James Baldwin, like Malcolm X, right? These were individuals who dedicated their lives, dedicated their daily existence to highlighting and exposing global injustices taking place in real time. And what Said says in Representations of the Intellectual that really resonated with me when I was a young man living in Detroit was that the intellectual must always tell the truth when faced with incentives, persuasions, and biases that might compromise the truth. And in that pursuit of truth, it might leave you lonely. It might leave you poorer. It might leave you disaffected and disenchanted in ways that are not as enjoyable as individuals who might, sell themselves and graduate within governments and graduate within corporations. That pursuit of truth can be a very lonely place, but it is the right thing to do, especially from an Islamic perspective. The truth is always the right thing to pursue. In another quote by Edward Said that I read as a young man from his autobiography called Out of Place, a really fantastic memoir of Edward Said's life, he wrote in the beginning of that book that I am an Oriental writing back at the Orientalists who for so long have thrived upon our silence. I'm going to repeat that because it's an important quote. I am an Oriental writing back at the Orientalists who for so long have thrived upon our silence. I took in and absorbed those words as an Arab, as a Muslim living in the West at a time when everything I read about Arab and Muslims was negative. Everything I perceived on television screens, news screens, newspapers, magazines about Arab and Muslims was negative. Every film that I watched as a young man, every television show that I watched as a teenager about Arab and Muslims was negative, right? The West, as a governmental, political, media, academic, epistemological movement, was wed to demonizing Islam at every turn. This was the system of Orientalism that Edward Said laid out and framed in his landmark book published in 1979. The idea that the West, and right, we're sitting here in Malaysia, which now is a beacon of Muslim governance around the world, but which was at one point a colony of the UK. Right? The West always perceived and peddled and plotted itself as being the superior, right, civilized. We all know the good virtues and values that are ascribed to the West, right? These bastions of modernity, right? Beacons of liberalism. A space where everything was progressive and forward moving, where innovation was thriving, where equality was available to everyone. This was the West. This is how the West saw itself in mirror opposite terms of the Orient, right? And what was the Orient? The Muslim world. If the West was all these beautiful, right, wonderful, virtuous, sublime things, then the Muslim world was everything but. It was backwards. It was barbaric. It was uncivilized. It was war-torn, right? It was a space where Muslim women were relegated. It was a space where governments were authoritarian and not democratic. This was the system of Orientalism that was just not available in books. It wasn't just available in texts. It was being peddled, it was being disseminated, it was being perpetuated on every major influential sphere of power, whether media, whether legal, whether academic, whether corporate. This is how the West saw us. So my positionality as a Muslim is and was dramatically different than your positionality as a Muslim in Malaysia. This is a Muslim majority country where your governments and your ministers, right, get to project a positive face of Islam for the population here in this country. My government was the opposite. It was wed to what? Demonization, marginalization, vilification of Islam and Muslims. So as a consequence of all this, being an Oriental, I wanted to write back. I wanted to fight back at the system of Orientalism, which is why I pursued an education in law. I thought as a young man, hey, I could become a businessman like my father and make a lot of money. Or I could become an athlete, but I wasn't very tall. And, and training for me was very difficult. So law for me seemed the ideal pursuit and the most sort of righteous pursuit of correcting the system of Orientalism that would become Islamophobia. So you might be thinking now, how is this term, what is this concept of Orientalism, and how does it relate to the focus of this conversation, which is Islamophobia? And we're not standing here on typical days. We're not sitting here today on this Jum'ah when the world is normal, right? We're looking at, in 10 days, a 1-year anniversary of a full-fledged, real-time, rolling genocide in Gaza. And when I say genocide as a legal term. I don't say it as a politicized term. A legal term that is defined by the 1948 Convention on Genocide that was forged in Geneva. Not by people who look like you and I, Minister. Right? By these European white men who classify themselves as civilized and look at me as uncivilized. Right? Two elements of genocide are what? Genocidal intent. Right? That a government has to have the objective, the design, the aim to eliminate whole or part of a population. The second part of genocide is genocidal action. And we're seeing genocidal action unfold in real time every single day in Gaza. My existence as a law professor, as a man, as a Muslim, as a citizen, as a law professor, as a son, as a husband for 355 days has been consuming and absorbing genocide on this phone, on this black mirror we carry in our hands every single day. So how does this genocide that we are facing and fixated on right now relate to Islamophobia? And the minister did an excellent job of regurgitating the framework that I theorized and that I provided in my work on what Islamophobia is. And I'm going to circle back to that. Islamophobia is a 3-part system comprised of private, structural, and also dialectical Islamophobia. The way in which this genocide and this impending war in Lebanon that we're seeing take place, you guys saw what happened this past week, right? Roughly 1,000 Lebanese have been slaughtered in the same way that Gazans have been slaughtered, that Palestinians have been killed. I am half Lebanese. My father, Allah yarhamu, is from a town in South Lebanon called Bint Jbeil. I grew up 2 years of my life in Beirut during the civil war in the 1980s. I know what war looks like being a child of war. I know what the sounds of Israeli/American jets sound like when they're soaring atop your buildings. I know what those sirens mean when they alert and they go off in the city that there's an impending attack, that there's an impending airstrike, that there's an impending bomb. I know what it looks like to see young children walking down the street without limbs. I know what it looks like to look at grown men tying themselves onto skateboards because they don't have legs anymore, and that's how they travel around the city. I know that these images we see of Gaza, of destroyed cities being made into rubble overnight looks like, because that was the Beirut that I knew as a young child. So apart from this intellectualizing of what Islamophobia is, from an existential standpoint, I know what Islamophobia in its most craven, its most evil, its most vile forms looks like through experience. So when October 7th happened, right, when Hamas did what it did in Israel, if you listen closely to the language, the speeches, the rhetoric of people like Benjamin Netanyahu. We all know who that is, right? Unfortunately. You know, inshallah, they'd arrest him because that's what they need to do with him, and he belongs somewhere in a prison. Minister, I don't want to get you in trouble by saying these things, but I'll get in trouble. And the minister said if the United States kicks me out, he'll give me political asylum here, inshallah, in Malaysia. So you'll see much more of me. But if you listen really closely to the speeches and the rhetoric and the proclamations of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, if you listen to the rhetoric of their national security advisor, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who ironically enough, his family's origins are from Iraq, they were using the language of the war on terror. They were using the exact same language that the Bush administration, right, and then eventually the Obama administration, then our good friend, the orange-skinned Trump, that he used when he became president, we're using to advance the war on terror. We all know what the war on terror is, right? I'm going to circle back and talk about the war on terror in a little bit. But what were they saying? They analogized Hamas to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They said that everybody in Gaza, especially the men, were likely terrorists. And we all saw these images of these men who were bankers and students and civilians, right, being stripped of their clothes, paraded around Gaza, and treated as if they were animals under this presumption that masculine Muslim identity was associated with terrorism. We saw these ministers and prime ministers and politicians and pundits all across Israel liken Palestinians to human animals, calling them termites, calling them snakes. This was the language of war on terror that the United States established, curated, and then globalized in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks. So in addition to the United States enabling the genocide by way of arming Israel with a limitless supply of weapons and billions of dollars, just yesterday, if you listened to the news, you saw that the United States gave another $8 billion to the government in Israel to advance its war. It's not a war, it's a genocide in Gaza, and to arm and fund its onslaught on the people of Lebanon. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret right now. I'm going to tell you guys something that might surprise you. For the Israeli government, they don't view Palestinians and Lebanese as distinct people. They don't view them as people. They view them as fodder, as collateral damage, as human shields that are sheep for slaughter, because the United States provided the template, it provided the framework, it provided the law, it provided the lexicon to advance this unfiltered, unhinged onslaught on a people just so and just because they can categorically label them all as what? T-word, hint, terrorists. If you call somebody a terrorist, you can do anything to them. If you classify somebody as a terrorist, there is no law, there are no rights, civil or human rights extended to them. They are irredeemable. They are individuals subject to the most vile, nefarious, furious forms of violence. And this is what the United States ushered in with the war on terror. This is the Leviathan of Islamophobia that comes to pass, that comes into being 23 years ago, as established, enshrined, and advanced by the United States. And we all know, sitting here, I'm an American, for better or for worse. You guys can scream at me later. I'm fine with it. My taxes, unfortunately, go to what's happening right now in real time in Gaza. But the United States is just not any country. The United States is just not any other government. It is a global superpower, the global superpower. So when the global superpower is essentially conflating an entire religion, our religion, conflating an entire population of believers, Muslims, people who look like us, people who believe like us, people who live like us, as terrorists. That is an endorsement from the most powerful government in the world, and perhaps the most powerful government the world has seen. And this is the language, this is the rhetoric, this is the structure, this is the law of Islamophobia that is being advanced right now in Gaza to advance this genocide. But not only in Gaza. We see what's been happening over the last decade in India. The minister and I talked about Hindutva being unleashed in craven Islamophobic forms in India. We see what's happening in China with the persecution and genocide of Uyghur Muslims under the banner of Islamophobia. An issue that sadly is neglected and overlooked, and why I chose to put a young Uyghur Muslim woman on the cover of the book. We see what's happening across Europe, most starkly in places like France with the headscarf ban, and now what's happening in Sweden. I've been to Sweden many times these last couple of years, and every time I came to Sweden, they tell me Sweden is the most inclusive, tolerant country in Europe. They take in immigrants and refugees of all kinds, of all stripes. But 3 years ago, you had the Sweden Democrats march in, right, and introduce a new form of nativist, xenophobic Islamophobia into the fore, which was a signal, right, that if the most progressive, tolerant, inclusive nation in Europe can become Islamophobic overnight, then Islamophobia can come to pass in any nation around the world. In 2019 in Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada, which is not too far from where we live in the United States in the state of Michigan, they also passed a hijab ban, making it illegal for Muslim women like yourselves to wear the hijab if they wanted to work for the government, if they wanted to teach at schools. This is the system of Islamophobia that is global, that is transnational, that has been made international as a consequence of the American war on terror. So if I say any one thing to you right now, one thing I want you to take away, as all these incidents that I've raised and many of these incidents that I have not raised that I'm happy to discuss are interconnected. What is happening in Gaza and what is happening in East Turkestan are connected. What is happening in India and what is happening in Kashmir is connected. In 2019, when the Indian government rolled into Kashmir and chose to annex it, what did the world do? It did nothing. When Russia rolled in a couple of years later and invaded Ukraine, what did the world do? It did everything. What is the distinction? The victims in Kashmir are brown Muslims. The victims in the Ukraine are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Western whites that we're willing to stand up for in the West because they look like us. But Kashmiris, because they're Muslims, are terrorists. When Ukrainians pick up Molotov cocktails to defend their homes and stand up for self-determination and sovereignty, what do they call them? Freedom fighters, heroes. When Palestinians do the same thing and have been doing the same thing, not for 355 years, but for 355 days, but 76 years since the first Nakba, what do they call them? They call them terrorists. The actions are one and the same. They're doing things that they ought to do, which is to protect their hometowns, their families, their schools, their children, their loved ones. The only distinction is what they look like and who they pray to. That is Islamophobia. I can stand up here all day long and provide you with legal terms and concepts and cases that spell out what Islamophobia is. But what is more telling, what is more emphatic, what is more emblematic is what we all can see on a daily basis on our television and now our telephone screens. But the minister said something that is very important for us to walk away with. And the reason I wanted to start off my lecture with providing you with a very bleak portrait as to what Islamophobia looks like is we cannot lie to ourselves. One of the intellectuals that Edward Said talks about in his book, Representations of the Intellectual, is one of my heroes, Malcolm X. You guys all know who Malcolm X is, right? Malcolm X, in my opinion, is probably one of the most brilliant men that the world has seen in the last maybe 200 to 300 years, right? This man was entirely self-educated, did not go to university, right? Did not have a bachelor's or a master's or a doctoral degree, right? He was entirely educated. He was a criminal, lands in prison, and when he comes in prison, he finds Islam, but also finds self-knowledge and education, right? Malcolm X said, power is knowledge. In order for us to identify and fix a problem, in order for us to find the most optimal prescription to any problem, whether it be Islamophobia or apartheid, right, or occupation or imperialism, we have to understand what those things are first, right? And now, inshallah, in this brief presentation, we all know what Islamophobia looks like in its most vile form of genocide. We know what it looks like in its most benign forms, perhaps. So what do we do to address Islamophobia going ahead? The minister said that a big part of Islamophobia is ignorance. There is so much global ignorance about what Islam is, what it entails. And when a people are ignorant, and I'm going to tell you guys something you may already know. Americans are probably the most ignorant people in the world. Despite having so much wealth, despite having so much access to information and education, they choose to remain ignorant, especially of Islam, right? But it's more than just ignorance, right? It's more than ignorance. Ignorance, the term ignorance, if you were to look at the word in the dictionary, right? Ignorance would mean lack of knowledge about a specific subject, right? Lack of knowledge. There's like a neutrality that is sort of like connoted from this word ignorance. But I'm here to tell you that it's worse than ignorance, because Americans have been spoon-fed, right, miseducation about what Islam is. They think they know what Islam is. And their knowledge of what they believe Islam is and who Muslims are tied entirely to violence, right? To national security threat, to radical activity, to backwardness, to terrorism. So we have a duty. We have a duty on the interfaith level. It is our duty to speak to anyone and everyone. And sometimes I speak to these young people, especially, these young activists in the United States. They're charged up. They're always angry, right? They want to put up encampments and tear this down and do all this ruckus. I tell them, and they always tell me, Professor Beydoun, it's not our job as Muslims to teach other people about what Islam actually is. They should do the work themselves. And I'm getting old now. I'm not a young man anymore, right? I'm always puzzled when I hear that, because I'm a student of history. And I'm like, okay, if it's not your job, then who do you think is going to do it? Do you think the U.S. government's going to do it? Is the U.S. government, have they at any point of their history been invested not only in educating the population about who Muslims are, but any marginalized or stigmatized minority? Of course they're not going to do it. Do you expect the media to do it? CNN or Fox News or the BBC or Sky News or CBC, are they going to do it? We know darn well they're not going to do it. How about schools? Are public schools going to do it? Of course not. So the responsibility specifically in the West, we don't have the great fortune you have here of having ministries like this to do the work and to do the da'wah. So the responsibility is on us in the Muslim community to reach out to anyone and everyone and have uncomfortable conversations with Christians, with Hindus, with Buddhists, and yes, even Jews. I've had many conversations with Jews over the years, and many of them who are Zionists. And they've been difficult conversations because these are individuals who are wed and they're committed and they're invested in the state of Israel. But my belief, and I got in trouble and almost canceled for saying this online, I said there are good Zionists. It is our job to persuade them because they've been fed so much misinformation and miseducation. They've been conditioned to think that Israel is a good state. Many of them have never met an Arab or a Muslim in their entire lives. But I can tell you from my experience that I have persuaded many individuals who are once Zionists to no longer become Zionists. So I want to close by saying this, and inshallah we can have a more fruitful conversation. I'm really excited to hear some of the comments and the questions you might have. Is I push all of you in whatever capacity you work in, live in, learn in, to have these uncomfortable conversations. They are the most important with individuals who look dramatically unlike you and who believe differently from you, to have these conversations, because that is where the most growth and persuasion happens. The second thing I want to leave you with is be proud of who you are, because us Muslims in the West look to you. We look to Malaysia. We look to the Malaysian population and the government, not only for leadership, not only for a template and a model that we can benefit from, but for more importantly, during hard times of living in the West. And I know many of you may follow me on social media. Some of you might have read my book, and you're like, how can this guy still have a job? How is this guy still not arrested? How is this guy still not removed from the United States? It's largely because we have faith, number one, in Allah, and that's the most important thing. But also, second, because I've had the great benefit over the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years traveling around the world, whether it be places like Turkey to be with my Uyghur brother here, Abdul Rashid, learning from him and the resilience that Muslims around the world have, but also from governments like this one who are unapologetically proud of being Muslim and representing us. Minister, you not only represent the Malaysian people, you represent Muslims all around the world. So you are also our minister as well. And the inspiration that we receive from you and your government is something that we always look to. So thank you so much. Shukran. Inshallah, we can have a fruitful conversation. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much. Yes, brother.
As what was rightly pointed out, Islamophobia is a form of Orientalism. And we cannot deny the fact that now we have this AI technology, where people see AI as part of the new era of colonialism. I'm not opposing AI, but the main issue is those who set the parameters of the AI.
Yeah.
Because so having joined together between AI and Islamophobia, colonialism and Orientalism, so we can't afford to fight or combat Islamophobia. Because this is very, very important, because I want to share, in Malaysia, we got a problem where we post any incident on Palestine in Instagram and Facebook. And I used to meet Meta representatives in Southeast Asia, and they always say it is AI. We are not the one who take down all the people of Palestine, but AI. So, but we know who set the parameters of the AI. So, being Oriental, you yourself and we ourselves, what we can do to have the new narrative of the AI, so that we cannot let them to set the narrative to have this more big on it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me rephrase the question. So you're exactly right. Islamophobia is an outgrowth or a spawn of Orientalism, and now you're identifying how AI, specifically on social media, is censoring voices and essentially engaging in what we can call digital Islamophobia, right? New sort of front of digital Islamophobia and censoring. And I myself have been a victim of shadow banning and ghosting and disabling of many social media features. Look, the reality is that it is a new threat that we face because big tech corporations are akin to the Western governments that once colonized, but they are not colonizing. They're essentially curating what conversations we can have and not have online. So I'll give you an example. Meta. Meta obviously is one of the big tech corporations that encompasses many of the apps that we use. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp are all owned by Meta. Meta is not a neutral, benign actor in relation to Israel, right? And I've closely researched it. There's been many studies that I can raise. One of them by Human Rights Watch that identifies how Human Rights Watch is a major international human rights organization that tracks human rights violations based out of the United States, ironically founded by Jews, mind you. Meta has strong connections to an Israeli IDF agency called Unit 8200. Many of Meta's leadership and executive sort of suite members came out of the IDF, came out of Unit 8200. And Unit 8200 basically is the surveillance arm for the Israeli Defense Forces. So again, back to the general point of how power is knowledge. Once you know that platforms like Instagram and Facebook are not only compromised politically, but are deeply connected to the Israeli government, and not only the Israeli government, but the Israeli military, the exact and precise faction that is unleashing this horrific violence we see in Gaza, we know what to do. We know how to respond. We know how to negotiate and navigate our online speech. And that's exactly what I did 5 months ago. When I realized that my platform on Instagram was being policed, and you guys all saw what happened with some individuals, including Sean King. Sean King had his Instagram account, highly influential. I think Sean King, in many respects in North America, was one of the most effective voices in Gaza because his audience was largely non-Muslims. They removed him. I saw what was happening to accounts like Sean's, to accounts like Bisan and Mu'taz and people on the ground in Gaza, and I said, something with the algorithm here is being highly repressive of any kind of humanizing or objective speech on the Palestinian people. And I realized at that point that in order for me to not follow the same fate, I had to make a market pivot, right? So no longer could you show videos of atrocities being inflicted on Palestinian people because it was violating their community guidelines. No longer could you show images. No longer could you make mention of organizations that they classify as terrorists. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. So if for anybody who's followed me in the last year, you've noticed that the vast majority of my content is text-based. They're words. And they're words for a reason, because the algorithm is not going to strike down language in the same way that it strikes down images and videos. So as a consequence of understanding how they were censoring, I realized that I had to do something different. And that's one way in which, so that's a story that I provide to sort of convey the idea that once you know what the obstacles are, you know how to overcome them. That's the short-term solution to your question. Right? The long-term solution to your question is, how do we, I mean, when I travel around the world, and I've been to Qatar, Malaysia now, I've been to the UAE, I worked in the UAE, Muslim countries are not impoverished. In fact, many of them are the most affluent in the world. Muslim societies are not uneducated. In fact, they're the most literate and educated societies in the world. We need to do two things as governments, right? Pump in millions and billions of dollars in research and development so that we produce platforms that don't discriminate against our speech, that don't strike down content that uplifts human rights atrocities, not only against Muslims, but against anyone. You know, as Muslims, we have to call out human rights atrocities even against Jews and Christians. I said it early on. I said if Arab were engaged in a genocide of the Jewish people, I would stand with the Jewish people. We don't stand with people because they look and believe like us. We stand with people because it's the right thing to do. So the long-term solution is we have to build platforms as Muslims that are honest, that are neutral, and that are committed to the truth. These platforms are not committed to any of that. There's a great book by a scholar named Shoshana Zuboff. It's called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Right? All these big tech platforms are only committed to maximizing profit in their bottom line. That's all they care about. Western societies at large are generally capitalistic. Their dean is money. Right? We have to provide another example to say, okay, it's not wrong to make money, but money should never come above principle. So that is a challenge that I have for Muslim majority countries and governments around the world, especially some of our friends in the Gulf who don't always do the right thing, to really put all those petrodollars and energy dollars into, inshallah, building a platform that'll be more benign, benevolent, and righteous. Yeah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, Prof Khaled. I'm Shazwan from Trip IT. Two questions. First, what do you think is more dangerous? Racism or Islamophobia? Because some people said that why do you need to highlight Islamophobia? Why not just call it racism?
Yeah.
What it is. Second question is there such thing as Islamophobia among Muslims? For example, I don't know. Let's say for the Palestinian issues, they said they do not highlight it as Islamic issues. Just call it human rights issues. Is that we can say Islamophobia also? That's my question.
Good questions. Yeah, let me take the first one first. And can I get some water? Anybody grab me some? That would be great. So the first question: what is more dangerous, Islamophobia or racism? Basically, Islamophobia can be racism. They're not distinct, right? They overlap. Much of Islamophobia, specifically what I call private Islamophobia, is the racialization of Muslim identity, right? Because race, as we understand it in the West, specifically amongst legal scholars who identify themselves as critical race theorists, is that race is a social construction. And Muslim identity has been racially constructed in line with terrorism. So much of Islamophobia, especially when it comes from private actors in society, is in fact racism. So there doesn't necessarily need to be a choosing between the two or a ranking between the two. What is distinct about Islamophobia, though, is that it is both racial animus, but also religious animus. So in my country, where we allegedly have free exercise of religion, you have the right, according to the Constitution, to believe and profess whatever religion you see fit. Islamophobia is also exacted specifically by the state in ways that undermine and compromise your ability to practice your religion as the way you see fit. So it's both racism and it's religious discrimination as well. Your second question is more complex, right? And I think one where we can engage in more discourse. And, some scholars who examine Islamophobia, one of them is a dear friend and colleague of mine, Hatem Bazayan, who teaches at University of California at Berkeley, doesn't necessarily believe that Muslim individuals can engage in Islamophobia. I disagree. I think that Muslims can, in fact, not only engage in Islamophobia, but be, in some respects, some of the most destructive agents or cogs in the broader process of Islamophobia. I'll give you an example. Do you guys know who Hamid Dabashi is? Hamid Dabashi is a professor at Columbia University. He wrote a brilliant book called Brown Skin, White Masks, published in 2013, and he talked about what are called native informants. Native informants are essentially members of marginalized communities, let's say the Muslim community, who essentially become co-opted by the state to advance the interests of the state. These are Muslims who are advancing the colonial, imperial, apartheid project of suppressing Muslims. An example would be, my wife is Somali, so don't get mad at me, Zamzam. Ayan Hirsi Ali. Remember her? Ayan Hirsi Ali was a Muslim woman who was being peddled and paraded around the world as a Muslim woman to bash Islam, right? There's another fellow in the UK who sued me a couple of years ago by the name of Majid Noaz, right? His whole claim to fame is I am a former extremist radical, right? Who's basically, what's the word? I've de-radicalized myself. And his whole career is being based on what? Demonizing and vilifying Muslims. A whole host, so Muslims can engage in Islamophobia and more dangerously in being used and exploited and co-opted to advance the broader Islamophobic project. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's a great question. So for those who don't know, the sister talks about PVE, which is preventing violent extremism. In the United States, we call it CVE, which is countering violent extremism, which is a new form of, thank you. which is a new form of counterterrorism policing that rises out of the UK with a program they had in place called Prevent, right? A lot of the, I would say, more democratic, liberal administrations around the world began to adopt PVE or CVE. It became popular like in 2012, I would say, around the world. So I've been a critic of the CVE/PVE model in the United States because it was advanced in a way to more surreptitiously for the state, including the FBI and the CIA, to penetrate Muslim communities and basically derail and undermine people's abilities to speak freely, travel freely, go to specific masajid, under the banner of the state perceiving anything that they perceive as being prospective radicalization. However, CVE is distinct in the sense that it really depends on where it is being implemented. I don't trust the US government to advance a CVE or a PVE project, especially within the context of the war on terror, where just 2 years earlier, they killed how many X million people in Iraq? In the very same year, the Obama administration, which was the champion of CVE, was incessantly droning Somalia and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Yemen. However, for some governments, right, especially Muslim majority governments, CVE looks dramatically different. Places like Tunisia or Malaysia, they look different because there are concerning elements. Oh, look, one thing, I'm going to say something, maybe it's controversial, maybe it's not. Sometimes when I say this in American Muslim communities, they get mad at me. But we can't act that there are not bad Muslim actors. We can't act that there are not bad Muslim factions and organizations and movements that we have to be concerned with, right? If we do so and not address them and let them do what they want to do, we're essentially inviting peril and disaster for ourselves. So within Muslim, the PVE model is entirely different within a Muslim country because Muslim governments understand Islam. Not only do they understand Islam, they are pushing Islam. This government is an example. So a PVE model in a place like Malaysia is dramatically different, and one that I would, not necessarily, I would have to research it more closely, but one that I would be less skeptical and suspicious of than a PVE or a CVE framework in the UK or in France. I published on CVE, I have many articles, or in the United States specifically. The war on terror, and this is where the distinction is, it kind of gets to your question. The real distinction with the war on terror is that the war on terror is an American project, an American imperial project that is inextricably bound to the baseline idea that all forms of Muslim identity are correlated with terrorism. It's rigid, right? However, with PVE, it's more selective and contextual, meaning that who is practicing the PVE program determines whether it is a destructive or a benign and potentially benevolent kind of policing project. Yeah.
Assalamualaikum, Prof. Shafiq from TV Al Hijrah. I just want to ask a short question. A few weeks ago, I heard Sami Hamdi say the good side of Islamophobia is Islam is thriving, and maybe I want to hear your opinion about that, and maybe related to Gaza.
Good question. Yeah, I've seen the brother Sami Hamdi speak many times, and one thing that he says that is definitely poignant, and one thing that I'd echo is that during moments of great crises, in moments of great catastrophe, they give rise to moments of tremendous curiosity, right? So what's happening now, globally speaking, and especially in the United States? In the United States, Islam is the fastest growing religion, right? Because what's happening as a consequence of all this Islamophobia that's taking place, right? When even my students, the vast majority of my students are non-Muslims. They're white students, right? From wealthy families whose fathers are lawyers and politicians and judges, right? And when they walk into a constitutional law class, they have to learn American constitutional law from an Arab Muslim guy. I take great pride in that, right? That I get to be the educator on American governance to all these white American kids. But when these kids and these Westerners see people like the Palestinians who are facing genocide, where 300 masajid have been destroyed and decimated, where every single college and university has been destroyed, where they've lost family members, they've lost homes, they're facing famine. But still on every Friday, they collect and they pray together for Jum'ah. That is deeply, deeply, deeply transformative for them to see that. So catastrophe is spawning curiosity in our religion in ways that are unprecedented. So Brother Hamdi is exactly correct in saying that, right? But I don't want us to celebrate catastrophe. We should never be satisfied, and we should always be committed to ending that catastrophe, because there are more productive ways than seeing brothers and sisters of ours being slaughtered to do the work of da'wah. But he's correct in saying that, but still, when I hear that, and I saw him speak in Phoenix a couple of months ago when he visited, I would like to see that happen during moments of a ceasefire in a genocide, where people wouldn't have to, witness and observe our people being slaughtered to be curious about our faith. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Thank you for your talk. You talk about the double standard of the West regarding the issues of justice and so on. So do you think that when Serbia is committing genocide in Bosnia, I think in 1993, do you think the NATO intervened because the victims are white people? And my second question is, as an outsider,
Yeah.
do you think that Malaysia has what it takes to be the global Muslim spokesperson for the Muslim Ummah?
Yeah, no, thanks for those questions. Yeah, the double standard, I mean, look, one great sort of pedagogical outcome of this genocide is that I think the world now sees very clearly that the West, and specifically Western powers, including the United States and the United Kingdom, the EU, NATO, are vehemently hypocritical, right? If they're stewards and champions of the rule of law and civilization, democracy and human rights, why are they only selectively applying it to spaces, into contexts that they approve of? The genocide in Bosnia and the Srebrenica massacres, for instance, it took some time for the West to intervene, right? Largely because the victims were white Muslims, essentially, European Muslims. There wasn't the swiftness of the response that was needed to stop the massacres and to stop the genocide. Milosevic was eventually prosecuted, but still tens of thousands of people were still killed before the West actually intervened and stopped the genocide. So, and we see this happening over and over and over and over again, and Muslims aren't exceptional, right? We saw what happened in Rwanda when the victims of genocide were black. We saw what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Congo when the victims are black, brown, and Muslim, right? But my question is, why isn't the West acting in a way in these contexts where the victims are not white to put a stop to genocide? It is highly foreseeable that if not for Western support, specifically American support for Zelensky in Ukraine, that we might have ethnic cleansing and genocide in Ukraine, right? But the West is acting to prevent it. It's funny, right? I was talking to one of the brothers last night, and I was remembering the Russian invasion, and I wrote this article called On Terrorists and Freedom Fighters that was published in the Harvard Law Review a year ago. And I was watching the rolling news of the Russian invasion with wide eyes and my mouth just kind of wide open, right? The things I was hearing and seeing, one of them was an NBC news anchor essentially said that this is entirely unforeseeable and unexpected, that we have a relatively civilized place like the Ukraine where war is uncommon. This is not Afghanistan or Iraq. He said that on live television. He said that on live television, we are a civilized country, the Ukraine is, where war is not natural like it is in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I stood there and said, any student of 5th grade history knows that the two most violent wars in modern time were in Europe, World War I and World War II. The Holocaust did not take place in the Middle East. It took place in Europe. The ethnic cleansing of Slavic people and of Roma people did not take place in the Middle East. It took place in Europe. 1 million Iraqis were not killed by Iraqis or Iranians. They were killed by Americans. 500,000 Afghans were not killed by Arabs or Kurds. They were killed by Americans. So if war is unnatural in the Middle East, it only becomes natural because of Western imperial powers invading that part of the world. And war has always been natural to Europe, especially in the modern context. So again, this is the process of unlearning that we have to engage in. I always say this quote and people get sick of me using it, but it's so poignant. One of my favorite authors, Nigerian author Chinua Achebe, right, wrote a great book called Things Fall Apart. He said that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. The most important response to war, colonization, occupation, and imperialism is we have to have indigenous intellectual guidance and leadership. What the minister said in the beginning, it's great that so many Muslims are becoming engineers and lawyers and doctors and physicians. We need more intellects. We need more intellectuals to indigenously carve and curate and craft our histories, not aligned with the West. There's too much mental colonization in places across the Muslim world. I worked in Dubai for a year as a lawyer, graduating from the top law schools in the United States. But every time an Emirati client walks in, he wanted a white attorney. Why is that? Because he associates whiteness and Americanness and Englishness with superiority, but I can do the job just as good as them or even better than them. But he looked at me as lesser because I was an Arab Muslim. So the only way in which we can overcome mental colonization is when we craft our own and curate our own thinkers and intellectuals indigenously in our countries. And that is where Malaysia can become a leader for the world. You guys have some of the finest universities, Islamic universities, learning centers. Our leaders, people like Imam Omar Sulaiman, a friend of mine, learned over here. There should be more exchange. And even more, I think even more important than being, and I'm thinking off the top of my head right now, and minister, tell me if this is going too far. But, but you know, us Americans are very stupid. We just kind of speak without thinking sometimes. But I think more than just being a model and example for Muslims globally, I would love to see Malaysia become the sort of centralized meeting point for Muslims globally. This is where conferences need to happen. This is where cultural intellectual exchange needs to happen. Every prominent Muslim intellectual, in my opinion, whether in the United States, Europe, or Canada, should spend some time learning in Malaysia. Because you guys have a system in place that we can learn from and take back to our countries back in the West. So in addition to just being examples and leading examples, I want to see more symbiotic and sustained exchange between Malaysian thinkers and leaders with Muslim leaders and thinkers around the world. Sure. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Oh, there's a series of ways in which I can respond to that question. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article called "Unveiling Gendered Islamophobia in the Law" with a political scientist by the name of Noura Siddiqui. And I wrote that article because it was very clear to me and very key to us as scholars and thinkers within the realm of Islamophobia to understand that this system of Islamophobia is experienced very distinctly across gendered lines, right? When the Western governments or Western media outlets think about terrorism, they are thinking about masculine Muslim identity. They are thinking about Muslim men, right? All these negative, violent, hyper-violent stereotypes associated with terrorism are manifested in masculine forms. Women experience Islamophobia in dramatically different ways, right? The stereotypes about Muslim women in the West are in some respects, the exact opposite of what they are for men, right? They're in the West, the Western imagination, Muslim women are dependent, meek, quiet, not ambitious. They're being oppressed. They're being suppressed by their Muslim men. So the ways in which Muslim women need to respond to that is to just be their authentic selves, to be honest with you. Because whenever I go into Muslim societies, whether in the Arab world, into the West, Muslim women are anything but that, right? You have these fictions that are being peddled by Western politicians and Western pundits that women are doing this. And the reason they're doing that is not, look, and one thing I want to say that's really important here too is not all of Islamophobia is irrational, right? That is a misnomer. Much of structural Islamophobia is in fact rational. And by rational, I mean that it is being advanced because it aligns with and expedites a specific political objective. And what is the objective with gendered Islamophobia, or what I might call feminine Islamophobia, right? One way in which the West can sort of like protect and project its identity of being, you know, a bastion of sexual freedom and liberalism and women having all this sort of autonomy over themselves is to police how women dress, right? To police how women dress. And who are the women that sort of clench onto religiosity in ways that clash with Western sensibilities of dress? Muslim women. So they want to police and punish the segments of society that are not going to accept and assimilate into Western sensibilities of what it means to be a woman. Feminism, not feminism at large, but Western conceptions of feminism. You know, it's funny, the West always talks about, and I teach constitutional law, and I spend a lot of time thinking about issues around free speech and free assembly, issues around like individual sovereignty, right? The West wants to be a champion of every individual should have liberalism. What is liberalism? The definition of liberalism is emphasis on individual rights, right? Everybody and anybody should do whatever it is they want to do, just as long as they're not punishing or hurting anybody. But it seems that the exception to liberalism is always the Muslim, man or woman. If you are truly a liberal, why are you policing how Muslim women get to dress? France? What is France? What is France's slogan? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberté is the first one. The first one. So it's liberal for everybody except Muslims. Right? The United States, free exercise of religion. So everybody can freely exercise their religion except Muslims. This is sort of the role that Muslim women play, is that they are sort of walking sort of emblems of the hypocrisy of Western liberalism. As a man, I could walk down the street, and I live half the year in Arizona, they're probably going to think I'm Latino. Unless I'm wearing a thobe on Jum'ah and growing my beard very long, right? Muslim women who practice Islam cannot hide their Muslim identity. So they are perpetually walking emblems of the hypocrisy of Western liberalism. Sorry if that was too sort of like metaphoric response. Yeah.
Maybe this question could be a bit personal. And for you as an American Muslim, currently we know America is facing upcoming elections, right, where we can see both parties are pretty useless, the Democrats and Americans.
You're being nice when you say useless.
Dr. Musliman said Republicans were vile and the Democrats were silent, right?
Yeah.
So, as you, for you as an American Muslim, what should you do? I mean, like, would you go out to vote? Who should you vote? Or maybe you discourage voting altogether? So, what's your opinion of that?
Well, I'm not a Salafi that thinks voting is haram. No, so look, I'm really struggling with this, right? Because we've all witnessed what's happened the last 11 to 12 months with this genocide, and we all know that it is not a Republican government in the United States which has financed, facilitated, and enabled this genocide. It's a Democratic government where Kamala Harris was the VP. She is culpable of this in this genocide. She, inshallah, one day will face prosecution from the ICJ for war crimes. I hope that happens. I hope that before I die, that Kamala Harris will face charges by the ICJ for war crimes, because she was the second most powerful person within this administration that enabled and advanced this genocide. So from my perspective, and I try to sit back and reflect and analyze all this stuff from both an individual, right, existential perspective, but also a communal perspective, because sometimes people look to me for guidance on these issues. I'll be honest. So I think for me, I find it to be morally repugnant, if not entirely immoral, to vote for Kamala Harris based on her criminal actions in Gaza. She's killed somewhere between 50 to 190,000 people who look like me and believe like us in 11 months. I cannot vote for her, even if she's quote unquote the lesser of two evils. And that's done. I can't vote for Kamala Harris as a separate matter. Now we go to Trump, right? We all know, you know, what did Trump say? And look, I was writing my first book, and I was writing a couple of articles. I remember December 7th, 2015. I remember that date like the back of my mind very distinctly. I'm sitting at home getting ready for a trip. I was going to Duke University to give a lecture, and Trump gives this talk at Iowa. You know, Iowa is an important state for presidential elections in the United States because it's one of the first caucuses, right? It sort of like assesses how good somebody might do in the upcoming election. And people were saying at this time, Trump's got no chance. Who's this guy coming out of like television running for president? Nobody took him seriously. They began to take him seriously at the Iowa caucus, because at that caucus, he said that we have to ban Muslims until we know what's going on in this country. That eventually became the Muslim ban, and that orange-skinned fringe politician that nobody thought would be elected became president. So we know that Trump is vilely Islamophobic. We know that Trump is not a friend to the Palestinian people. We know that Trump is going to engage in a whole host of domestic and foreign policy that is deleterious to the Muslim population and the Arab population. So we are choosing between Monster 1 and Monster 2, right? I cannot vote for either. In my position right now, it might change, is that there are some things more important than presidential elections, which is to stick by your principles. So at this juncture, my vote is a protest vote and not to vote. I feel uncomfortable saying that publicly, to be honest with you, because this is where the struggles of an intellectual sort of clash with the struggles of an individual who is, you know, I guess somebody perceived or looked at for guidance. For young people, right? Young people, because sometimes before you come into political knowing in a country, to divest yourself from voting can be a dangerous thing when compared to a middle-aged man like myself who's voted before. So sorry if that's sort of a roundabout response. But look, can I say this really quick before I finish? I am going to vote down the ballot. Local candidates, state candidates. Maybe the one person I don't vote for is the presidential category.
Okay, Assalamualaikum. I'm Intan, a civil servant. I think I'm not going to pose a question, but I would like to just share something or touch regarding ignorance. Okay, so for us, even though we are in a multiracial country, I think most of us, our grandparents and our parents taught us that we must despise Yahudi or Jewish. Yeah. I think Ustazah and Ustad also said that in Quran, we should despise Jews. However, my first connection with them was when I was 17. We had a global competition, and the Jews were from Israel, and they were, well, the girls and boys were handsome, and they talked eloquently. And when I was doing my postgraduate studies in London, my classmate was actually an Israeli. However, she was really courteous to our Muslim classmates, and she was more like oh, you're praying, you need to pray, you need to fast. So she was really courteous. And when I delivered my child in UK, she actually visited me. And that's why ignorance, I think, because one thing I didn't know about Nakba 1948 until I think 2014.
Yeah.
However, when my father-in-law went to Jerusalem, Baitul Muqaddis, I actually contacted her. However, do you see that, even though I know at that time, I knew about how the Zionists were, but I actually contacted my classmate. However, since 7 October 2023, it has been a bit difficult for me to contact her. So for me, I think this is a self-reflection that, yes, I was a friend to a Zionist or Israeli. And actually, when I was in London, I was living in Middlesex, and there were a lot of Orthodox Jews who actually followed, and they were attired more modestly than Malaysian Muslims.
Yeah.
So, any feedback, Prof?
Yeah. No, I mean, thank you for that wonderful reflection. I think the way I'd respond to that is to say that we should never view any community, whether religious or racial, as a monolith, right? And we should never indict or dislike anybody because they're a citizen of any state. We don't know what their circumstances, right? Look, I'll be when I see these young Jewish children who are taken hostage and kidnapped, that hurts me. They're children. They don't choose to live in that country, right? Your friend may not have chosen to be born in that country, right? Sometimes it's important for us. This is what I try to do on a daily basis is before I view things through a political lens when I meet an individual, I try to view them through a human lens. And once you humanize an individual, it enables you to have these difficult political conversations with them. So no, I think especially even as Muslims, right? As Muslims, we are never taught to dislike or hate not only any one person, but an entire population. So yeah, your story is one that resonates deeply with me because I have many friends, many of my colleagues, in fact, are, legal academia has many Jewish law professors, and many of them are Zionists. I'll tell you a story. So a story is 2 months into the genocide, I'd taken my job in Arizona, and I was sitting there teaching. I'm sitting in my office, and a professor of mine who believes in the two-state solution and is a supporter of the state of Israel walks into my office and hands me a check to donate to children in Gaza who have been negatively affected by the genocide. So yeah, I think human connections are stronger than political connections, and we have to sort of like focus in on those as best we can, and it can be hard, right? During moments like this when we're really driven by emotion. Yeah. How can we do it being diverse? Without, can you read the question into the microphone? Is that okay? I'm not hearing you very well.
I mean, how can we do it without touching on the sensitivity of others? I mean, some people might be sort of sensitive to the message of Islam, so maybe your advice on it.
I think as Muslims we all have different roles.
But the words for some people, basically they believe that if you connote Islam and the phobia is not put in the word into the right thing. So how we trying to overcome this situation and understanding that Islamophobia is considered now as an industry. So this is basically the way of us dealing with this narrative, because somehow being described throughout the world. If you want to introduce a new term to refer to this, probably there will be another issues. Secondly is with regard to the incident, I mean, when we can see the uprising of the young generation coming from states, from the Western countries, and they are the one who now, I believe that they are the one who promoting, or they are the one who propagating the ideas of protecting the Gaza and Palestinian, compared to our brothers and sisters here in Malaysia in particular, and various countries, and we can see that the trend or the sentiment or the way how we see this situation probably is different. So how do you see, because of they believe now, because the issue that we discussed earlier is on the information that they're getting previously before the event, when you mentioned that the daily incident that we now receive throughout our phones. So basically that what makes them believe that they need to fight for the Gazan and the people. So probably what will be your comment on this? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, brother, for those questions. I have a lot to say about the second question / comments. I'm going to save that and respond to the first one. That the term Islamophobia might not be conceptually sort of apt in addressing the range of threats and range of perils, because you're exactly right, it's more than a phobia, and there's considerable debate among scholars, activists, that we should, adopt another term. Some people have introduced the term anti-Muslim racism, anti-Muslim bigotry as a replacement to Islamophobia. My response is, I don't care. I just care that the term does the work that needs to be done. Right? To me, the term is basically just a tool. It doesn't have to be sort of a phonetically all-encompassing phrase that explains the distinct forms of Islamophobia that are taking place, whether from the government or whether, like you've observed, it being an industry, because it is very much an industry that governments, corporations, and private actors are entirely wed to and benefiting from, right? Benefiting from the bottom line. Brilliant book by Nathan Lean, right? Nathan Lean wrote a book called The Islamophobia Industry that talks about how major think tanks, major corporations, government subcontractors, and governments are benefiting to the tune of billions of dollars. I mean, we could look at the case study of the war in Iraq as being a very lucrative Islamophobic campaign that made people like President Dick Cheney, a multi-millionaire because of his stocks that he owned in many of these military industrial corporations in the United States. So you're exactly right. It is an industry. But again, the way I think about Islamophobia, and the reason I use the term, is because the court of public opinion has essentially chosen Islamophobia as the term of choice, right? We see this at protests. We see this online. We see this at academic institutions. The minister said that he wants to see centers on Islamophobia studies come into being. We have one at the University of California, Berkeley. We were going to have one at my university until they pulled their funding because I became so visible and vocal on Gaza after October 7th. So they took their money away, and my center is no longer in existence, but inshallah it will one day. So the Islamophobia industry is very strong, not only in rewarding Islamophobia, but punishing Muslims like myself, right, who engage in criticism and dissent of Islamophobia, especially war, and cracking down on the rights of Palestinians. Now, your second question is an interesting one, and it's one that I've spent some time thinking about, especially because the last several months I've been spending a lot of time writing my fourth book, which is on Gaza, and a book, inshallah, which will be coming out in March or April. Hopefully for Ramadan it'll be out. Look, I think that the reason why young American students are more emphatic in protesting is a reflection of the increased culpability of Americans with regard to this genocide, right? It's the U.S. government that has pumped tens of billions of dollars weapons, war machinery, laws, policies, advancing the genocide in Gaza, not the Malaysian government. So in my estimation, American citizens, students have a greater responsibility to protest than Malaysians or Indonesians or Egyptians or even Lebanese or Jordanians, than anybody else. Because it's their tax dollars. It's my tax dollars. For every $1,000 that I earn, 35% of it goes to the US government, which then goes to billions of dollars that turn into F-35 jets and dumb bombs and missiles and tanks that are killing people who look like me, that believe like me. So there's a greater responsibility for American citizens and students to protest, even if they aren't Muslim, because if they are principled people, they will look in the mirror every morning and say that it is their government that is committing these atrocities. Now, we all have a responsibility, even beyond the United States, right? Based on not only religious identity, sure, there are Muslims that are being killed, and we can empathize more as being Muslims, seeing our Muslim brothers and sisters being slaughtered. That should drive us to protest, that should drive us to donate, right? But again, it's an issue of principle. I want to see Muslims stand up for any and every genocide, regardless of who the victims are. I don't care if they're Buddhist or Hindu, or if they're Christian, or even atheist or agnostic. Whenever Muslims see injustice, we have to be the voices of justice for the world globally. But Americans, and I'm an American telling you this, have a greater responsibility to protest more than anybody else as a consequence of their money and their votes being translated into genocide. I feel worked up for some reason. I don't know why. I don't want to perpetuate any stereotypes of Muslim or Arab men. I think I saw a hand back here. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's a great question. I'm going to say something provocative, but I want you to sort of grapple with it and understand that the United Nations, although a benign and benevolent institution, is a reflection of Western colonization. The fact that it's all Western European nations, with some exceptions, sitting at the Security Council tells you a bit about who the West thinks should make the most important decisions in the world and who has the right to stop genocide. So if there's any one thing that I would advocate on behalf of, it's reform of the United Nations, because the reality is that the General Assembly can only levy what are called persuasive positions, right? The votes that the General Assembly produces and delivers have no binding authority. So the vote from last week, where the General Assembly said that Israel has the responsibility to end its occupation within the West Bank and in Gaza and stop the genocide, and we can no longer arm them, nobody has to observe that. It's just persuasive authority. It's like when your big brother walks in the room and says, "Khaled, stop eating my food." You're probably not going to listen to him unless your mother and father tells you that, right? So your mother and your father are basically akin to the Security Council, right? The Security Council can make binding law. But what's been happening at the Security Council is the United States has vetoed every and any attempt not only to end the occupation and to, even like one thing that's really important for us to understand is this genocide and this ethnic cleansing has been in place much longer than 355 years. We all know these resolutions that the UN passed extending the right of return to the Palestinian people, right? To stop the settlements. Have the settlements stopped? No, in fact, they've been accelerated. Have Palestinian refugees all around the world had the right to return? No, they haven't had the right to return. So the United States has done everything to obstruct positive policy toward the people of Palestine by virtue of exercising its veto power. Which is why, like you've referenced in your question, we need not only Muslim governments to become part of the Security Council, Muslim governments should be pushing for, and this is one thing that President Erdogan of Turkey said that I agreed with when he said this 5 or 6 years ago after the United States vetoed the second ceasefire vote, that the UN needs to be reformed structurally where it's not 2 or 3 countries or 5 countries total dictating whether a genocide should end or not end. Yeah. Yeah.
So, is there any inconsistency with that effort? At the same time, you have this problem within your own country, but at the same time, you're also trying to so-called resolve the issue.
Yeah.
What are your comment on this?
My brother Abdul Rashid here is representing the Uyghur population, so I love him very much. I don't want to get him mad at me, but but you're right in observing how China has, in some respects, championed the Palestinian cause and said the right things, and in some respects they pushed for a 2-state solution. But there's a really important article written by a law scholar named Derek Bell called The Interest Convergence Dilemma. And what he essentially says in this article is that we sometimes are smitten with this superficial idea that governments take principled positions out of like altruism or philanthropy, that they actually care. Like China actually cares about the Palestinian people. Or the United States, when they stand, when Trump said that it was a genocide in East Turkestan, that Trump actually cared about Uyghur Muslims in East Turkey. They don't. There's a selective championing of crises or struggle when it aligns with the interests of that imperial power. And Palestine aligns with the imperial interests of China. Why? Because the United States is staunchly Zionist. So this is one way in which China can stick it to their geopolitical rival. And what does China want? They want to expand and entrench their presence in the Middle East. And what is the optimal way to gain the support and trust of Arab societies? It is to champion the Palestinian cause, right? China, they're not idiots, right? They know what they're doing. So I would be highly suspicious of China's championing of the Palestinian struggle. Yeah.
Brother Hadi from the Federal Mufti Office. I would like to know your personal opinion. Does it, for you, do you think that nowadays, why there is so much level on the Islamophobia and so on? Is it because that nowadays the Muslim world doesn't have any big brother or superpower that can, caliphs or the big guy, control this? No one. What's big for Islam? One boy for Islam.
I don't think so. I've never been an advocate that we've needed a one sort of paternalistic voice to represent the entire Muslim global population, right? I think, in fact, it can become divisive when we've had that. I mean, one recent example of that would be in the rise of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, when the Ayatollah Khomeini tried to advance himself as being the unitary voice for the entire Muslim population, globally speaking. That was more divisive than it was, sort of galvanizing. I think more than looking for one leader, it's been, in many respects, the sort of destructive and backwards examples that many prominent Muslim majority societies have had, right? And being more self-interested. They've acted more as nation states, as governments that are more in tune and keen in advancing their own economic and political lot. I'm not going to say specific governments, but many of us can probably guess which ones that I'm talking about. Many of them being the wealthiest, in some respects, Muslim majority countries that have been not only idle and silent when it comes to genocide in Gaza, but are actually forging relationships with the state of Israel, right? And they're choosing economic interest rather than siding with ending a genocide on individuals who, like today on Jum'ah, will pray like they pray, right? So I don't think we need one unitary leadership. I think we need a collection of moral leaders and governments and nations that do the right thing because it's the right thing. Yeah. Walaikum assalam.
Why, among other religions in this world, why they attack Islam?
Yeah.
Why they label Islam as food?
Yeah.
But why there is no Christianophobia and so on?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. So my joke response is they hate us because they ate us. No, but the reality is that, look, Islamophobia has come into being for a range of reasons. Number one is because, look, and Christianity has been mutated in many respects from its original form, right? Europe has essentially recolored and re-racialized Christianity as a white religion. In the United States, if you walk into any church and you look up at a picture of Jesus, he looks more like he's from Stockholm than he is from Nazareth, right? They've basically reconfigured the entire faith of Christianity as being a mirror image of Europe. And they view Christianity as a white religion. I think the reason they view Muslims as being threatening is we're a sleeping giant in the West. We threaten Western white racist sensibilities in a range of ways. Number one, we're the fastest growing religion. Number two, unlike other racial and ethnic minorities, we don't want to assimilate. We're proud of who we are. We're proud of our faith. We're proud of the system and the lives that we lead, and that threatens the West. Third, we have very self-reliant, independent communities. If you go into the United States, for instance, and you come to my community where I live, which is a suburb right outside of Detroit, Michigan, in a matter of 15 years, we've gone from immigrant, working class, poor community to an economically thriving community. So we don't need the government for benefits or handouts. We're entirely self-reliant. So when you become independent and you don't want to assimilate, and you're proud and unapologetic about who you are, you become a threat. And that's a big part of the cultural tentacle of Islamophobia in the West. It's like colonization all over again, but on a domestic scale. Because what is colonization? You're beating down a native people, right, to surrender who they are and become like who their master is. And when you rebel against that, right, you become a threat. Has anybody watched the film The Battle of Algiers? Please watch that movie. It's a wonderful film. The revolution, the Algerian Revolution against the French, is one of the most inspirational case studies. And it's this exactly. Frantz Fanon talks about in Wretched of the Earth, Black Skin, White Masks. He wrote a really brilliant article called Algeria Unveiled that talks about the sublime sort of specter of the Algerian Revolution in a native people rejecting the idea that the West is superior, right? And nobody, especially the French, who are the most arrogant of the colonizers, don't want to hear that. And that's why Islamophobia and why Muslims become a threat, because we don't want to assimilate. Any final questions, comments? I can stand here all day long. This is fun. I feel like I'm in one of my law school classrooms. No, thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation with all of you. And inshallah, we'll have many more. Masalama.
Thank you, Professor Khaled Beydoun, for that enlightening address and also insights, which will serve as a foundation for our contributions in becoming the voice of movement against
bang? Ha? Bang.
Assalamualaikum. So, Abdurrashid Haji, as a global outreach manager of Drop Mercy, I would like to just give small explanation about this MOU. Alhamdulillah, Drop Mercy is like a charity based in Canada and by very excellent people. And Drop Mercy is the one actually let me link it to Professor Khaled and also link it to very amazing people around the world, and also one of the most contributed organization to the Uyghurs in Turkey, and also other people in Gaza and Palestine, Gaza, Pakistan, India, and also Somalia, Sudan, and Bangladesh around the world. So Droplets of Mercy would like to extend its work, actually combining its efforts and capacity with Global Peace Mission Malaysia, and to work out more to the people who are in need around the world, especially in Gaza when all this thing is going on. Alhamdulillah, this MOU will be first step to implement a very, very great project proposed by Global Peace Mission. It is actually education program for Gazan children, which is displaced from their homes. So, Alhamdulillah, I am very, very honored to sign on this in name of Droplets of Mercy as an Uyghur and the witness of Deputy Minister and also Professor Khaled. So it is very good opportunity for me. Thank you so much.
We pray that the partnership between Global Peace Mission Malaysia and also Droplets of Mercy in humanitarian mission will be blessed by Allah. Thank you. Next, let us welcome the session of souvenir presentation from Prof Khaled Beydoun to our Deputy Minister of Religious Affairs, YB Senator Dr Zulkifli Hasan. Please welcome. Thank you. As we conclude today's event, let us carry forward the lessons learned. Together, we can be the spokesperson towards a more inclusive and understanding community. Malaysia can be a centralized meeting point for Muslim globally, inshallah. And last one, to have symbiotic exchange between Muslim leaders in Malaysia and also globally. Thank you for your participation in Usrah Madani 4.0. Let us continue to build bridges and foster peace in our diverse society and even internationally. And if we happen to travel in those countries with huge Islamophobia, let us change the narrative with our manners, the least we can do. On behalf of the organizing committees, I would like to apologize if we have done any mistakes throughout the event. With that, as the master of ceremony, I'm Fatima NK. I would end this session with Wabillahi tawfiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Safe travels, and we hope to see you at our future events. Thank you.